All right. How are you, Matt? All right. So we're continuing our study of kings and prophets. I'm kind of surprised, and I'm going to brag on myself a little bit. I did not expect to get through all of First Samuel and did a little extra last time talking about Saul. But this week we are talking about King David, and there are some things that just as housekeeping measures we need to address. There's sorry. So in our Bibles, we have First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, and First and Second Chronicles, which is interesting. And I don't know how many of you have interacted with, I guess, a Catholic or Orthodox Bible, but what they have is First, Second, Third, and Fourth Kings, and then First and Second Chronicles. It doesn't mean that they found extra books of Kings. What they actually did is they took First and Second Samuel and just renamed them First and Second Kings or Kingdoms. And they took First and Second Kings and renumbered them Third and Fourth Kings, because what they're picking up on is these four books of the Bible all go together. It's in one chronological string. However, First and Second Chronicles is written after the fact. It's written after the return from exile. And so it's trying to retell the same history, but in a very, much more condensed form. And this is important because almost all of First Chronicles is the life of David. And then they try and shove all the rest of the history of the kings into Second Chronicles. And another point that needs to be made is First and Second Chronicles is not, we'll read in First and Second Kings, it is not the rest of the acts of King Asa recorded in the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. That's not First and Second Chronicles. It's another book that we just don't have. That doesn't mean it wouldn't have been considered scripture. It's not like someone cut it out. It's just one of those, it got lost to time. And so what the chronicler is doing in First and Second Chronicles is not giving a full detailed list like of the kings and prophets. Rather, it's just trying to give a general overview. And so we'll be jumping between Kings and Chronicles here in the next couple of weeks. But today we kind of kick it off with, we'll be looking at Second Samuel and also Chronicles. And so similar to what we did last week, I'll start us off with a map of what the kingdom of Israel looks like at the beginning of the reign of David. Is already much larger or slightly larger than that the kingdom of Saul. Saul's take the little pink portion and just shrink it down a little bit more. By the time Second Samuel comes around and David is fully anointed king, the territory of Judah is expanded because of his victories against the Philistines and the Amalekites. We're seeing some strengthening of their military presence in some areas. But what will end up happening is everything that's colored in from about that point south, that's all going to be what David conquers by the end of his lifetime. And so that's kind of the expanse of where David's kingdom grows from. And similar again to last week, we'll have the family tree on the back of your little pink handout. And I'll give you some time to highlight some things because it's a little difficult. First, like I did last week, highlighting the tribe of these kings. The kings of Judah, it's really easy because they're kings of Judah, so they're from the tribe of Judah. However, once we start getting into the divided kingdom, the tribes of the other kings of Israel kind of switch up where we're at. And then, of course, this is one of the last weeks we'll mark the kings in blue. Next week I guess we have one more week with where we'll mark the king in just blue. In 2 weeks, I'll try and show it in two different colors so they can stand out because some of them are related to each other. And really, when it comes to talking about the children of David, all the ones that we know by name have some importance. And so I'll bold and underline those, and conveniently all the bolded and underlined names are the ones I took off. So I'll give you guys a little bit of time if you want to fill those in. But I also, this week, we're now to the line of David, which is the line of Jesus. And so I went ahead and starred the relatives or the ancestors of Jesus as the genealogies point out. And something I don't think we necessarily take note of, but both Solomon and Nathan, who are sons of David, are in the two different genealogies of Christ. One is the line usually ascribed to Joseph, which follows the line of the kings, which is in Matthew. So of course Rehoboam would be the ancestor there, but Nathan is the one that Luke lists, and some will argue that's the line of Mary. So on both sides, you can either flip those or argue for either or, but it is important because both, or at least two of the main gospel authors note that the sons of David are in the line of Jesus Christ. That will become important later. So I'll give you guys a couple more seconds if you need them to write down some of these names. I know they're not the easiest to spell, but I think they are a little bit easier than last week's, with the hyphens and the chefs and all of that. And so Marissa, are you good? Okay. So just to recap where we left off last week, we were starting to rush through it because it was getting close to time. And it was kind of towards the end of Saul's family's real importance. And so what we see, well, there's still one, which we'll talk about this week. But what we see is David is in this civil war against this northern kingdom that has anointed Ishbosheth to be king over the northern tribes, but the southern tribes say no, it's David. And so there's this bloody civil war. Ishbosheth ends up getting killed by his servants or bodyguards or protectors. And at the end of this, David is then finally anointed king in 2 Samuel 5 over all the nations. Many would say, well, clearly this is the point where David becomes king. But I would argue David becomes king in 1 Samuel 16 when Samuel comes and anoints him. It's one of those moments where from that point on, David knows he's king. God knows he's king and sees him as king. He may not have the crown. He may not be the one sitting on the throne. But effectively from that point forward, David is king. But now he's finally able to sit on the throne and wear the crown. And one of the first things he does is recorded in 2 Samuel. This is also one of the few instances of where it's also recorded in First Chronicles, but this is in where am I? 2 Samuel 6, and it starts off David. Sorry. That costs a lot more than I want to replace currently. So, oh, I skipped a slide. So it starts off, David is wanting to return the Ark of the Covenant. There's been a whole lot of switching of hands of territories. There's been battles. Saul may have been ruling over a unified kingdom, but it wasn't a very strong unified kingdom. We know that the Philistines ended up stealing the Ark of the Covenant back in 1 Samuel 4. But what we're seeing is now David's trying to figure out where is the Ark of the Covenant, because he's sitting there and he's wanting to bring it to Jerusalem, where he's establishing his capital. And it's not where Saul's capital was because, well, Saul never brought it into his capital, which kind of goes to show that that strained relationship between God and Saul. Saul was trying to distance himself at times from the presence of God. And of course, the Ark of the Covenant is somehow conveniently forgotten where it is. That's always one of those things that in Indiana Jones, it's always like, how could you forget such an important artifact? And I think, yeah, they forgot about the Ark of the Covenant quite a bit in the Bible. So I could understand why, wait a couple generations and, oh, we forgot where it was. The holy seat where God rests. We just forget where that is. But so David, when he brings up the Ark of the Covenant, the way it's phrased is David is trying to bring the Ark of the Covenant forward so that his kingdom might be blessed, so that he can be recognized as the king of Israel. So it's similar to, we can think of modern politics, that those first couple of months in office, politicians do a whole lot of what they said they were going to do, so that everyone thinks that they're going to continue that. That may or may not happen, but it's one of those, David is trying to do a lot more so people recognize him as the one doing it and not God. And so there's those who disagree about this story about this is what is happening. But as they're traveling along the road, David is at the front of the Ark, and the Ark is kind of tailing behind David and the musicians and all these people who are playing music to declare the way for the king, but they put the Ark on a ox-carried or ox-driven cart. It's a rickety cart, is from what it sounds like, because as the cart is moving along, the Ark looks like it's about to fall over. And so Uzzah reaches out and touches the Ark and is immediately evaporated or struck down or smited, as some might say. I know this doesn't seem like it's about David, because the story says, well, David's not anywhere near the Ark. David just is leading this group. But what we think about is, we can think of back to the rules that Moses was given about the Ark of the Covenant. We think about when the Israelites entered the land with Joshua. The Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be going ahead of them. They were supposed to be the ones following. The people were supposed to follow the Ark. Joshua never led the Ark anywhere. There was no triumphal musical leading of the Ark. Rather, the Ark was supposed to be carried by the priests. It was supposed to be dignified, and it was supposed to go before the people. And so in this moment, I think it's that reminder it's that sobering moment for David. He realizes he's led to someone losing their life because he's done something wrong. It still kind of stinks for Uzzah. He lost his life because he reached out his hand and touched the Ark. And so it seems like one of those moments where God is so unfair. God is this God of violence. He acts out against people who just do small things. But the way I see this is, God's telling David, you are not leading my people the way I've chosen you to lead. You're supposed to be a good man after my own heart, yet you ignore the things you're supposed to do. Especially because I think David's one of those kids who knew he wanted to be a preacher. And so he does the things like I'm going to kind of call myself out here, who dresses up in the suits and carries the big old Bible. And I guess that makes sense why I want to be a preacher, or I've wanted to be a preacher. But David kind of does the same things. He goes to these temples, he goes to these holy places, and he always wants to wear the ephod. He always wants to wear the priestly garments. He always wants to be wearing the clothes of the priests. However, he can't be a priest. He's not born of the right family. However, he always wants to be wearing the uniform. It's like if I were to wear a basketball jersey, I may want to play basketball. I want. They're not calling me to play basketball ever because I am not that coordinated. But it's one of those moments where David has to humble himself before God. I mean, he actually lets the Ark of the Covenant stay in a foreigner's house. The way it's described is a foreigner is living in the land of Israel, but it's closest to where they were at that time. And he said, let the Ark of the Covenant go there. And to this, what later would be considered, especially once you start looking kind of how the New Testament world's shaped, you would never give what's holy, the Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God, to a foreigner. They're very much in this idea of, no, we keep this with the Jews. But whether it's David so afraid of the wrath of God, and so he's giving it to an unsuspecting foreigner, or whether it's more of he has to distance himself, it can't be someone who's loyal to David or not. There's a whole lot of stuff going on here. But the main idea is David makes a mistake. He's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet he comes to a point of repentance and is later overjoyed when he's allowed to finally, he got himself right, and he brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, how it's properly supposed to do it. Kind of. The priests are now carrying the Ark. David is still before the Ark, but he's in a very humbling appearance. He takes off his clothes and starts dancing before the Ark, which is always a weird story because you always have those people who are kind of like the old people in Footloose who are like, no, dancing is of the devil. You can't ever do it. And then you look in the Bible and David's dancing naked through the streets of Jerusalem. And so it's just one of those moments of David is a man after God's own heart and has his own way of celebrating the victories that the Lord has given him. But as he's dancing through the streets, his wives start to pay attention because they're watching their husband dance through the street.
So he did it for the ladies.
Sure. In a way, because one of his wives, Mike, yeah, I'm getting in my own head now. The daughter of Saul, which last week we mentioned, they got married as a way of Saul trying to keep David close. It's that old adage of keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. Because like the next chapter, Saul throws a spear at David. So I'm guessing David had some rough in-laws. But Michael, who David fought against her brothers to have the right to say, no, this is my wife, return her to me. He's fought in against her father. He's gone through lengths to have this union restored. Michael then says, I disagree with you on how you are worshiping God. You have brought shame upon your entire house, which is kind of rich coming from the daughter of Saul. But it's one of those moments where, because of this, David kind of curses Michael. Michael loses the favor she had before David. And so Michael never gives David an offspring. And so effectively the line of Saul is finished. And David continues to go on. It's described he goes into his poetry phase, which we know he goes through because he writes 150 psalms. And there's even more that aren't considered psalms, but are psalms that are just in the Bible and outside the book of Psalms. And he continues on, and he's having these great military victories against the Philistines and the enemies of God. And he, no matter what he does, he seems to succeed. And in this moment, we hear the story of Mephibosheth. This is Jonathan's son, so Saul's grandson.
And keeps him though, right?
Yes. And so, yeah, so David keeps him because he loves his friend Jonathan, and he loves He wants to still do something to redeem what he feels like is his own personal failure. David feels as if he has failed his friend because he wasn't there at the battle that Saul and Jonathan died at. And David hasn't really yet crossed off that way of, in his mind, bringing justice to his friend. And so he hears the story of Mephibosheth. Now Mephibosheth was the grandson of Saul. He was a kid when Saul dies. And in this moment, when Saul and Jonathan and the other two eldest sons of Saul die, the servants hear that Saul's dead, and fearing both the Philistines and David, take Mephibosheth. And the servant is running and ends up dropping Mephibosheth as a child on his head, and he becomes paralyzed. And where we pick up in the story again, David has sent out his servants and these messengers, and he says, "Bring me Saul's grandson, bring me Jonathan's son, so I may speak to him, so I may bring him into my house." Now Mephibosheth has some of the remainder or the remaining loyalists of Saul who are helping him and kind of advising him on what to do, and because he's still a young man, he doesn't know how to run a household, and he doesn't know how to manage money necessarily. And these servants that Mephibosheth has become worried, saying, if David is seeking you, that means David's seeking you to kill you. So you need to go hide. You need to go flee David. Yet David keeps sending out more and more messengers saying, "Where is Mephibosheth? Bring him to me so that I may speak to him." And Mephibosheth eventually is brought to David. And unlike what Mephibosheth has kind of been told by these poor advisors, David is overjoyed to see the son of his best friend. He wants to bless and praise Mephibosheth. And it becomes one of those moments of Mephibosheth, similar to the prodigal son, tells David, "I'm not worthy of this praise. I'm not worthy. I'm the son of your enemy, or the grandson of your enemy, Saul." But David reminds him, "No, you're the son of my friend, Jonathan." And so what ends up happening is David makes Mephibosheth like one of his sons, not in the way of he can inherit the kingdom, but rather in a way in which Mephibosheth eats at David's table. He is considered one of the best advisors of David, and until Mephibosheth dies. And it's one of those moments of you see the character of David as he cares for this cripple.
He still treated him like a prince.
He treated him like a prince. He didn't treat him like, "Oh, you're an enemy of mine. You're not I'm going to make you suffer because of what your grandfather put me through. I'm treating you like you've always should have been treated. And you're being treated as my son just as much." I'll stop here. Is there any questions that you guys have so far? There's a lot more to get through on David's, but we can take a little extra time if we need to. All right, we'll keep going. Now we get into the less PG stuff. So David has a few more military successes, but then it becomes one of those times when he's kind of getting lazy. And he decides, you know what, I'm not going to go out to battle this time. He's not where he's supposed to be. He's supposed to be this king, this champion, similar to how Saul was supposed to be a champion for the people of Israel against Goliath. David is supposed to still be leading this military campaign, and yet he's back in Jerusalem. And as he's sitting out and surveying Jerusalem from his palace, he sees this beautiful woman bathing. He's filled with lust and calls for her. And this is Bathsheba, and they have sexual relations. And it's one of those, David has fallen in this trap. But knowing he's fallen into this trap, he doesn't at first repent. Rather, he starts to find a way to undo what he's done by making it seem like Uzziah,
Uriah.
Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, is the one to impregnate Bathsheba, because they're looking at the math and it's not adding up. Uriah's been out on the battlefield where David's supposed to have been.
Yeah, he tells him to go to the Uriah and
Yeah.
have fun. And he sleeps in the doorway, doesn't
Yeah, Uriah actively does the opposite of what David tells him. David tells him, go drink, become intoxicated so that maybe you'll sleep with your wife. And Uriah doesn't. He doesn't become a drunkard. He doesn't belittle himself. He's still a man of honor. And so he sleeps
in David's doorway.
in the doorway of David. He's still in the sight of the king. And so this makes David frustrated. And so he says, surely you're tired from this battle that you've been on. And he says, I am, but I'd really like to be back on the battlefield because I know the mission that I've been sent to do is not done. And so David finally gives up and sends with the messenger this order to put Uriah on the front lines and put him in the worst defended position and make him attack this place where surely he will die. Put him in this position to where he will die and I can marry Bathsheba and my sin won't be ever found out. However, it is found out because this is one of our prophets that we get to. Last week we had Samuel, which Samuel's a judge and a prophet, and he has a whole lot of titles. But we get to see is David's prophet, which is Nathan. And Nathan comes to him several times in the Bible. One, because he's one of David's best advisors, because he's a prophet of the Lord. But he's also the one to consistently call out David's sins. And what he does is he tells the story of someone who has stolen from another man and has made spoil, and then yet has framed this man into the point of where the man who he stole from is to be put to death. And David says that man who's done all this should be the one put to death. If this happened in my kingdom, this would be what I would do. As chief legal authority, I would put the man who stole and has put this man to death, or has made it to where he would be the one to die. I would reverse the sentences.
And then Nathan was like, that man's evil.
Exactly. Nathan then says, well, David, you are the one who has stolen the pride of this man. You are the one who sent him to the lines to die. This child that Bathsheba is carrying, God will take it from you as the consequences of your actions. And so David spends the next months and weeks lamenting something that hasn't even yet happened. He's growing tired. He pleads with God for this child to be spared, and people are trying to get him to eat, but he won't eat. They're trying to get him to drink, and he won't drink. And he's just crying out, "Please spare this child." However, God keeps His word to David. You have done this misdeed, and you must be punished. And so this child that they have is never born. However, Bathsheba does end up bearing a child very shortly after. I'm assuming it's not immediately after, because that's not how that works. But we get to the point where Bathsheba does end up producing an offspring for David, and that's Solomon. And so Solomon is finally born. But what we get is the sons and daughters of Abigail and the other wives of David are starting to act up towards the end of this point in David's reign. And so what we get is, give me a second, I forgot, Ammon and Tamar. Similar to the story of Judah and Tamar, there's incest and not so great stuff going on here. Because Ammon is the oldest son of David, and Tamar is the oldest daughter, and Ammon is filled with lust for his own sister. What we see is he brutalizes his own sister. In this moment, we kind of have to wonder, where's David? Where's David? He's clearly not a very good manager of his own house. He's not a very good manager of his own life. Because we see this horrible act happen. What happens is Absalom, the second son of David, kind of takes charge. He's going to be the one to get vengeance for his sister, and so he ends up killing his brother. And fearful for what David might do to him for killing his older brother, Absalom flees the presence of David. But what we see is the people start to send message to Absalom saying, "No, you are the one who did right. We don't know why David didn't seek punishment for Amon. He had plenty of time to react. He had plenty of time to figure what was going on, and figure out what needed to be done." But what happens then is the will of the people starts going to Absalom's head. He starts listening to the people, and the people have a point. You did what was right. You brought justice in a way to your sister. But what happens is Absalom, the son of David, the eldest son of David now, leads a revolt against his father. In 2 Samuel, it kind of goes on for a while. This idea of David's lamenting this idea of having to fight his son. He has to send men to go defend his claim as king because he has to fight his own son. But he knows what his son did and is doing is wrong, but it's still his son. And however, Absalom doesn't seem to have such ideas. So it keeps going on. Absalom gains support and kind of leads an army towards Jerusalem. The advisors of David decide, David, it's time for us to leave the city. Leave this capital that you've spent so much time trying to build. Kind of skipped over it, but David's wanted to build a temple for God. He wants Jerusalem to still be this place where the temple for God will be, where this palace of David would be. And it's all in that moment starting to fade away of this would possibly happen. David's disappointed that he has to leave, but he knows it's best. And he's struggling with, he's just had some really bad experiences trying to communicate with God. He's been in this weird funk with God where he knows that God's there for him. He knows he's the shelter, the everlasting, the wings in which he finds refuge in. But at the same time, he's looking around and he's seeing people turn against him. He's seeing fields burn. He's seeing his own son turn against him. And so what ends up happening is David flees to Ziklag, which again, going back to last week, Ziklag is where David held his wealth while he was fleeing Saul and was hiding amongst the Philistines. And so once again, he returns to Ziklag, this place where he returned the wealth of and the women and the children to, and then some. He returns to this place that's loyal to him kind of to the end. We say with Jabesh Gilead, certain cities who kings have great military success with, who did, or either the kings liberated them or gave them wealth to. Those cities can continue to remain loyal to those kings, regardless of what the majority of people were doing. There were still those small pockets of people who were faithful to the end to these people. We saw with Jabesh Gilead, they went across into the enemy camp to retrieve the bodies of Saul and his sons to bring them back and give them proper burial. And once again, in David's time of need, he's able to go to Ziklag and is protected and cared for. But what we end up with is we're starting to see that pattern that we'll see a lot in the Old Testament, where the people's will, where they want Absalom to be king, versus God's will, who God has said David is king, come into conflict. Because when Absalom enters the city of Jerusalem, the people are crying out praises to the king. Long live the king. This is the king of Israel. Hosanna. It's very similar to kind of what it's similar to that moment when David brought in the Ark of the Covenant and was dancing naked. They were shouting the same praises. When Jesus makes his triumphant entry, there's those who are shouting the same praises that were shouted at Absalom to Christ, because they are putting their full weight and support behind this king. And this is the capital that David built. And David never wants to be the one to lead the battle, but he commands his men that, yeah, we need to go fight his son's men. And what ends up happening is in one of these attacks, Absalom is fleeing on a horse. And Absalom, one of the very few descriptions we get is he has long flowing hair. And it's thick and it's dark, which this one decides to paint him as a blonde-headed guy. But it's thick black hair. And what ends up happening is as he's fleeing one of these generals of David, his hair gets wrapped around this tree and he's basically hung to death because it just yanks him off. And the general runs a spear through him. So if it wasn't because he was hanging and broke his neck, it's because there was a spear driven through him. And when this general returns to David, David becomes distraught. Similar to how 2 Samuel began, when David receives the word of Saul's death and the death of Jonathan, his first response is not to rejoice because his enemy is defeated. His first response is sorrow. He's in despair. He wishes that his enemy did not die. And especially this one adds a little bit more to it. Because Saul, yes, he was the anointed of God's. It was God's anointed, and so he was deserving of lament on that way. Jonathan, David's lamenting because he lost his best friend. This guy who looked out for him, who was always there for him, is now dead. And now, of course, this one, yeah, he's his enemy, but this is his eldest son. This is my son who is dead. And it's one of those, in that moment, people are saying, no, you need to rejoice. Your enemy is dead. But David can't get over the fact of, yeah, but this is my son.
This is baby.
This is my baby. I held him when he was fresh out of the womb, and I've watched him grow up before my eyes. Sure, he has turned against me, but this is still my kid, who is now dead. And so what ends up happening is David breaks out the red carpet. He wants this funeral to be one of the biggest things in Jerusalem, I guess, social calendar. It's supposed to, he's going before even the armies, because he has spared his enemies, both those who are loyal to Absalom and these people who have sided with him in these cities. He doesn't devote them to destruction. He spares them. He says, just return, be loyal to me, and I will do you no harm. But David follows his son's, I guess, funeral procession pretty closely. And it's one of those moments where it's recorded, even the Prince Solomon doesn't quite understand why David is going through such emotional upheaval because of this. And he sits there, and his generals look at him and says, you need to stop lamenting. He would not have lamented the same way for you if you were the one to die. But David says along the lines of, but you don't know that. This is still my baby. This is still my son. He builds him a monument. It's this moment of David is in this, he feels pain, and he's kind of in this haze, kind of for the rest of his reign. A lot of the laments, the more sorrowful psalms that are written, people think this is definitely when they started, at least some of the big ones start showing up, because David's in this ultimate distraught of, I've lost 2 sons, and one, sure, my second son killed his older brother, but that doesn't make either of their losses any different. Sure, my eldest son did wrong. That doesn't make the pain any less. Um,
His hairs are dropping like flies.
they are, which we'll see, kind of helps Solomon because he's still a boy at this time. There's not as many eldest sons or older sons to really challenge him for authority. But as we see, David will occasionally still have to come up against enemies, whether it's rebellious cities, whether it's neighboring cities or neighboring countries. I think that they can be the one to best this David, because as we mentioned last week, David's already kind of grown in this legendary status, and so definitely as they're starting to hear, wait, David, this guy who's killed giants, who's killed tens of thousands of Philistines, this guy who's won almost every battle he's been present for, this guy is weak. He's crying in his chamber. And one, we have the death of this child out who's conceived out of adultery. This child, or the death of his firstborn, the death of the second-born son. This David is appearing weak, and so occasionally David will still have to defend Judah. But as he gets older, he recruits the mighty men. These are already present when he's still young and with Saul, but these are men, whether they're from Judah, but some of them are also foreigners. They're outsiders who've come and recognized this is the king I need to follow. This is the guy I'm hitching my wagon to. And it's one of those, we don't get a whole lot of stories about these men, but they each have their own special expertise. And what they do is they end up recruiting out of David's men and the armies that they're put in charge of the best men and forming them into even better versions of themselves, so that David's army is never considered weak. These mighty men of David, these are the best of the best. Saul would find good men and attach them to him as quick as possible because he wanted to have, of course, the best players are playing for the Yankees. Well, that's not what David does. David finds a few really good, strong players or military people, soldiers, and says, I want you to then go find the best that you can find and train them to train others. We think of kind of the model that Jesus will establish with the church. Jesus finds the 12 and says, I want you to be my 12, but I need you to go find your people who you can then pour into. Paul finds his Timothy and Titus, and they find their followers, and that continues to build up the health of the church. Likewise, David kind of has already installed this idea with his military. I'm finding my few people that I can really pour into and can teach everything I know. But then I'm going to want you to go find your people and teach them, make them the best that they can. And then we get to the last, I guess, misdeed of David. One of his generals, this is not one of the mighty men. This is one of just some guy who's in charge of the armies. He comes to him and says, David, I know you're getting up there in age, but what we need to do is take a census. We need to know what we have. And God through Nathan says, no, you don't take a census. I'm explicitly telling you not to do this. It's like when a parent says, no, don't shove that into the light socket. That's not good. I'm telling you not to. Well, David takes the fork and starts heading that way anyways. And he ends up taking the census. And again, it's one of those moments of, well, taking a census, that's no big deal. It's counting people. What God seems to be really getting upset about the little things, especially if we were to read it just in the way of First Chronicles. We have this instance where Uzzah is killed for touching the ark, which seems like a very small thing. And then at First Chronicle ends with the story of David takes a census, and so God basically says you have three options and none of them are good. And so a lot of people will point to some of these stories and they misunderstand what's happening. What's happening here is God's saying your strength does not come from your people or the numbers or how much you can muster in the moment. Your strength comes from me. That's where your power comes from. You need to be faithful to me, and what David said. And so don't take the census. Well, David hears that and says, okay, I'm going to take the census because I still want to know what I have. Where's my strength? After God just said, your strength's in me. Stop thinking of this like the other nations do. We saw this, it became a problem with Saul. Saul was always trying to compare himself to the other nations. That's kind of why he was chosen, because the people wanted to look like the other nations. And so it's that same idea of you're not getting it. You're not supposed to be like the other nations because you're my kingdom. God is saying, this is my people. I'm going to take care of you. Don't worry about the things that the other kings worry about.
They were worried about superficialities.
Yes. And so what happens is David takes this census and God gives him three really bad options as his punishment. But David ends up saying, give me the punishment that affects just me. Yeah, it's going to be worse, but it ends up where it's just the city of David. So it's Jerusalem, but it's the one that affects him directly. It's the one that the people will look and see, why is this only happening in the city of David? Why is people have come in and out of towns and they're saying that it's not happening in near the Sea of Galilee. It's not happening in these other places. It's only happening where David is. It's only happening because of David. But at the end of this, David seeks to make it right. This is one of those moments where I think this is what it means when God says a man after his own heart. David is faithful through it all. He may make mistakes. We all make mistakes, right? But that doesn't mean we just say, yeah, God, we made mistakes. I don't need to say I'm sorry. I don't need to repent. I don't need to make it up. I don't need to do what's right. Rather, I can just mail it in. Because that's what Saul did. He never thought of it as I need to go tell God and repent for what I've done before God. I don't need to make it right in God's eyes. God just knows I've messed up, and there's no way of redeeming myself out of that. I think, especially in the church, or not even necessarily the church, but the people around us in the church who are outside, think of it that way. That if God knows everything I've ever done, there's no way that God can forgive me. There's no way I can make up for what God already knows I've done. But we see this with David. We see this with what Christ has done for us. Is God is very forgiving. God forgives us. We just have to make acknowledgments before God. We need to have that relationship with God where we say, God, I've messed up. I need to go before God. I need to repent. And so that's what David does. He goes and finds a hill, which this is the hill in which they build the temple upon under Solomon's time, which, if the legends are true, this is also the hill that Abraham comes to sacrifice Isaac. This hill is very important. If every legend, and because the names change so much, it's hard to say, but they'll say this is where Abraham took Isaac to be sacrificed. They'll say this is where David made the sacrifice, repenting before God. This is where the temple is built. This is where these very monumental things in both the Jewish and Christian faith happen. And we know this is where the temple is built because David buys this plot and leaves it to Solomon, basically in his will, saying, this is the land that I have purchased for you already. This is where I want the house of God to be built. Because he goes to this man, and the man says, no, I'll just give you this land. I'll give you everything you need to make the sacrifice. But David says, no, then it's not me making the sacrifice, is it? I'm not losing anything from this sacrifice. It's really your sacrifice that I'm doing for you. And so David wants it to be clear, no, this is a sacrifice that I've paid for the land. I've paid for the materials. I've paid for the sheep. This is my sacrifice to God. And I'm surprised we're already to this point. But years pass, kind of between Second Samuel and the beginning of First Kings. But David is now an old man. We're starting to hear the whispers of Solomon's older brother, which I can pull that back up because I forget his name, Adonijah. Adonijah is one of the last sons of David and Abigail. Whereas Solomon's the first of the sons of David and Bathsheba. What we're seeing is the elders of the kingdom of Israel. These military advisors, they're all trying to pick sides. Nathan's trying to pick sides. Bathsheba's trying to pick sides. And of course, Bathsheba wants her son to become king because there's no promise that one of the other sons of David would still want to protect Bathsheba once David is gone, because his loyalty would be to his mother and not some other wife of David. But what we also see is Nathan, who's a prophet of the Lord, comes and says, David, you need to be putting your blessing on Solomon, not Adonijah. This is one of those moments of that doesn't make sense. He's not the oldest son of David. We don't even know how many of those other 12 sons come before Solomon. We just know that there's 12 other sons that David has. And so somewhere along there, we see that Solomon has been chosen by God. There's this promise of this line of this messianic line, this line that David's been promised through a covenant will become greatness. That is through Solomon. And so one of the last things David does before giving up the ghost is he blesses Solomon and names him very publicly as his heir. Solomon is to take over the kingdom. So that's where we'll pick up next week. It's kind of in that weird area of Solomon is still young, but that doesn't mean he's foolish. So
I think God gives him knowledge. It's like he didn't ask to destroy your enemies or for revenge or anything like that anybody else would ask for. You asked for wisdom first.
Yep.
So God gives it to him.
Exactly. Is there any other questions you guys have? I know I, again, sped through a book of the Bible. So that makes 2 in a row. Next week will only be 10 chapters. So, yeah. Now you guys can. Getting out early from class is not the same when you're not in school. And you're here willingly. But I thank you guys for a good day here.